Well, it looks like our video judging the situation of the specs in the raid didn't last much, because just the day after, Blizzard comes in with some class tuning that will go live the next reset, the moment Season 2 begins. So there are actually quite some interesting changes amongst this bunch. Some of these are quite less important, but still, we can go over all of them to see what Blizzard has been thinking, because these changes in particular are after Blizzard's so-called observation of the results of these first few days, this first half week of the preseason, where they get to see how the specs are performing with some of the balance tuning that they received in 10.1. The first of the changes is quite neutral, because it's a very slight buff to Havoc Demon Hunter. The buff is to melee auto-attack damage to Demon's Bite or Demon Blades, as well as Fellblade. All of the damage of these abilities increased by 10%. This is not even a 2% buff for Havoc Demon Hunter, in particular in single target, so it's not really that relevant. And then also a slight buff to Isolated Prey, now increasing your single target I-beam damage from 25 to 30%. So it's just a very minor increase to the single target damage of Havoc Demon Hunter with this change. It is perhaps quite relevant because Havoc Demon Hunter is about to lose their current tier set, which quite significantly empowers the damage of Chaos Strike, which is a good buff to your single target, while the next season's tier set will be primarily around I-beam damage and more AoE damage. So perhaps Blizzard is trying to sort of balance the loss of single target Havoc is about to have by losing the tier set, by buffing their base single target damage. What is a bit more interesting, I would say, is the buff given to Vengeance Demon Hunter, because Vengeance gets their two baseline rotational ability, Shear and Fracture, buffed by 10%, as well as Soul Carver damage buffed by 20%. On top of that, Focused Cleave now increases Soul Cleave's damage to your primary target by 40% instead of 30%, and now Soul Crush also gives you a longer duration frailty on your primary target. Now it lasts for 8 seconds instead of 5. So this is even more increase to the damage of Vengeance, which was lagging a bit behind the rest of the tanks, together with Blood Death Knight. This has been a question some players will have. Why exactly are they buffing Vengeance when, you know, the damage of Blood DK is basically even worse than Vengeance? It might have to do with the fact that some of the defensiveness, some of the self-healing of Vengeance also comes from the damage they are doing, whereas Blood DK is mostly just self-sufficient based on the damage they are taking, a bit more than a Vengeance Demon Hunter. Still though, it remains kind of a problem, the AoE damage of a Blood Death Knight in Mythic Plus, so this would make Vengeance a little bit better. They also have an interesting tier set which could bring them more towards the right side of their talent tree, towards the fire build, fire damage, fiery brand side of their build. But yeah, you know, it always feels a little bit sad when you see a patch with some tank changes and you don't see, for example, a spec like Guardian Druid being mentioned, but just Vengeance Demon Hunter in this case. Even though the changes to Vengeance Demon Hunter were warranted, as it wasn't, you know, a very strong spec. Talking about the lack of changes to Guardian, we enter Druid, and indeed, we have no changes for Guardian. There are a couple of very tiny changes to Feral and Resto Druid. Resto Druid gets 2% more healing and 2% more damage. After the first few days of 10.1, we saw that Resto Druid was lagging behind the rest of the healers in the raid. Once again, worth mentioning, we don't have the tier sets yet, so this might be bound to change, especially given the power of the tier set of Resto Druid, but Blizzard saw it fit to already try to buff them a little bit. And then there is the slight revert of the buffs that Feral received in 10.1. Rampant Ferocity now deals 30% of the damage dealt by Ferocious Bite instead of 35%, and Tear Open Wounds now deals 50% of rip damage instantly instead of 60%, so a slight nerf in the AoE of Feral, which is very, very strong right now compared to their usual style, which used to be more single target focused. but not very major. Anyways, what is a bit more important is the change to Balanced Druid. As Blizzard points out, and as you can see here, in some single target scenarios it's still looking optimal to cast Wrath in Lunar Eclipse. So you were basically ignoring the whole part of your mechanic where you cast Wrath in Solar Eclipse and you cast Starfire in Lunar Eclipse. They were just ignoring this rotation to keep spamming Wrath. So now Wrath Astral Power generation has been reduced from 10 to 8 and the damage has been decreased by 5%. But now Wrath does 40% more damage in Solar Eclipse instead of 20%. Also, Soul of the Forest now increases Wrath's Astral Power generation while in Solar Eclipse by 60% instead of 30%. So essentially you lose 2 Astral Power when you cast Wrath, but if you're casting Wrath inside of Solar Eclipse, you're basically gaining that Astral Power back. Also, damage dealt by Fairy Dragon summoned by Denizens of the Dream has been increased by 25%, and Friend of the Fae now increases your Arcane and Nature spell damage by 10% instead of 8%. So the majority of these changes are to make sure that you cast Wrath when you are supposed to, which is your Solar Eclipse, and not have the casts spill into Lunar Eclipse as well. It is still overall a net buff, a net positive for Balanced Druid. What instead is not a net positive but just a negative all around is the nerf to Holy Paladin. I should say nerfs to Holy Paladin. We mentioned yesterday when we checked at how the raid was doing that Holy Paladin now suddenly found itself as the #1 HPS healer. We pointed out about the benefits of increasing players' health by 25% and increasing the damage received by 25%. Holy Paladin was having much less overhealing to their strongest heal, which was Avenging Crusader. Avenging Crusader also received the big buff of being able to now have its healing spread to 5 targets instead of 3. So it made it even easier to not overheal. It made it easier to try to spread the healing as effectively as possible, and it turned out to be very powerful. The result is that now all healing and damage has been decreased by 3% for Holy Paladin, and also Avenging Crusader now transfers 500% of damage done into healing instead of 575%. This used to be 750% over 3 targets, then it was turned into 575% over 5 targets plus scaling with your mastery, and now it's down to 500% on 5 targets scaling with your mastery. This will overall hurt you quite a bit. It's going to be a 7 to 8% overall throughput, overall healing decrease for Holy Paladin. It still keeps Avenging Crusader as the best option for Holy Paladin, the strongest pick in the raid in particular, but it tries to rein in the power of this ability. Of course, it would have been nice to receive some compensation buffs to a few other weaker abilities, like for example Holy Shock, which is not doing nearly as well anymore, or for example, why would the damage also be decreased for Holy Paladin? Because while it is true that Holy Paladin's damage in the raid was always solid, it was always top 2, together with Discipline, it was a much bigger weakness in Mythic Plus, where AoE was concerned, and the AoE of Holy Paladin, basically ever since they lost Ashen Hallow in Shadowlands, has been much weaker and continues to be weak in this new patch. It will continue to be weak, so this 3% damage nerf does not feel too nice for Holy Paladins with Mythic Plus in mind. We then have a roughly inconsequential buff, which is the buff to Mistweaver and Essence Font, which is now increased by 15%. Now, Essence Font normally is not really used a lot by Mistweaver monks, and this buff might as well be nothing. You can use Essence Font a little bit more in your rotation as a monk, but even then, even when you use it more, this won't even make it to be a 2% healing buff for Mistweaver. So it is definitely quite the small increase to the spec. And you finish the ability changes with Rogue, and in this case it's Subtlety. This is more like a hotfix, more like a fix to a problem about the passives and talents of rogues scaling with other things other than your abilities. In this case, talents like Veil Touched, like Deeper Daggers, and like Dark Brew no longer affect damage from sources outside of your class and spec. So those talents increased, for example, your magic damage or your shadow damage. So you could use things like the ring that does fire damage, the trinkets that do magic damage, the embellishments that do magic damage, and your talents were actually scaling those effects to do more damage. Now they are not going to work anymore, so in return Blizzard is giving you 4% more damage to all of your abilities for subtlety, to compensate for the fact that these talents are no longer going to scale your non-class abilities sources of damage. These were all of the abilities and talent changes in this hotfix coming live next week. We also have a handful of tier set changes because Havoc, you have the 2-piece set bonus of Havoc now increasing your agility by 10% instead of 8%. So when you spend 175 Fury, you gain this 10% agility buff, which is very good, it's very strong because it lasts for 6 seconds. You can keep it up quite often given the amount of Fury you can spend, so it's a pretty good buff to an already decent set bonus for Havoc. Assassination gets a similar treatment to the nerf, so to speak, of Subtlety. Now the set bonus of Assassination increases nature damage only from class sources. So again, if you had an embellishment or a trinket that did nature damage, this 2-piece set bonus was also going to increase that damage. Now it doesn't anymore. It only increases nature damage from your class and spec abilities. Lastly, the other part of the compensation for subtlety is that the 4-piece set bonus now causes Symbols of Death to increase the crit damage of Eviscerate and Black Powder by 40% instead of 25%. So a significant damage increase. It's like a 65% increase to the power of this 4-piece set bonus for subtlety. So if the one before was a neutral change or a very slight nerf at best, for subtlety, this change to the tier set moves it into the slight buff category. So maybe now we are there. Maybe this will be the last of the rounds of the hotfixes before the season actually launches and you get to go into the raid and into Mythic Plus. We have seen most of these being buffs because Havoc and Vengeance were both buffed. Balanced Druid overall was buffed, as well as Resto Druid, Mistweaver Monk, and Subtlety Rogue. We also saw very slight nerfs, one to Feral, and the more impactful, definitely across all of the changes, has been the nerf to Holy Paladin, to the throughput of Holy Paladin, and perhaps somewhat confusingly also to the damage of Holy Paladin. So this is all we have today for this Saturday. As I said, I still think and I still hope that we might have time for some few changes before the season actually opens. Perhaps there are a few specs that have some bigger problems that might want to be fixed before the opening of the season. Maybe Guardian, maybe Assassination, maybe Frost Mage or Arcane Mage, maybe Frost Death Knight as well. Maybe we have time for one last set of changes before next week, next reset, and the season actually opening. But for today, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your weekend. So we are starting with our goodbyes, of course, to the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You can still, don't worry, support completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself, because that's apparently what YouTube wants. You can also then follow me over on Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream over on Twitch, which is going live soon for the beginning of this season 2. With this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys likely tomorrow, and in the meantime, for once I wanted to keep the video somewhat short, and I think I'm kind of okay with it.